This will be a place of congregation, of order, of peace, of prayer, of hope, of humility.
Hi everyone, my name is Salima Shivji. Welcome to Sundays at the Ismaili Center, Visionary Voices. I'll be your host for this event, the first in a series all centered around the Ismaili Center Vancouver and its 35th anniversary. Throughout the series, the idea really is to reflect on those 35 years since the center was first inaugurated. We'll be speaking with people who were involved in its inception and design, those involved in its opening, as well as those who put in all of the hard work now to make sure the center runs smoothly on a daily basis. To start things off on today's program, here is the Aga Khan Council for Canada President, Amir Ali Qasim Laka.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to provide welcome remarks on this special occasion, the 35th anniversary of the Ismaili Center Vancouver. We are privileged to have former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney join us today. Prime Minister Mulroney inaugurated the Ismaili Center, and so we are fortunate to have him with us for this celebration exactly 35 years later. I recall Mr. Mulroney's words at the opening ceremony when he spoke of Canada as a place in which diversity is a strength and in which we are protected from the winds of violence and unrest that have afflicted so many parts of the world. The Ismaili Center in Vancouver is one of 6 centers worldwide and was the first of its kind in Canada, the second being the Ismaili Center in Toronto. The others are in Lisbon, Dushanbe, Dubai, and London, cities that, much like Vancouver, contribute to a rich tapestry of global heritage, each drawing on their own respective histories, traditions, and cultures. The Ismaili Center Vancouver serves as a symbolic marker of the permanent presence and core values of the Ismaili community in Canada. In its architecture, programs, and activities, the center reflects a mood of humility, forward outlook, and friendship. It has hosted Canadian citizenship ceremonies for those who call Canada their home, lectures and seminars on space and the cosmos, youth events such as the Olympic Truce Dialogue, summer festivals in its courtyard, and more. In its design, the center illustrates and represents our intellectual and spiritual understanding of Islam and its social conscience. Its spaces serve as areas for social and cultural interaction, spiritual contemplation, as well as intellectual engagement and exchange. As a bridge to friendship and understanding, the center enhances relationships amongst the diverse peoples, communities, governments, and civil societies of Canada. Over time, it has become a place for learning, celebration, and exchange of ideas that foster the value of pluralism, which is core to the Canadian ethic. In this way, since its inauguration, the Smiley Centre Vancouver has served as a place where Canadians come together to cultivate and deepen bonds with both one another and our single Creator. Speaking of our bonds with our Creator and the limitless presence of Spirit in all matter, visible in every direction we turn, Mr. Mulroney had described the Smiley Centre as a building that tests not just our appreciation of form and light, but of the intellectual and spiritual messages that are revealed in its marble, sandstone, and glass. We hope the Smiley Centre will continue to serve the role of deepening bonds for many generations yet to come. As the Smiley community approaches the milestone of 50 years of settlement in Canada, the Smiley Centre Vancouver will continue to stand with permanence for the values of hope, peace, intellectual exchange, and pluralism for Canadians from all walks of life. Thank you, Mr. Mulroney, and all our distinguished leadership and guests for being part of our celebration today, and to all those who have contributed to make His Highness the Aga Khan's vision for the Smiley Centre a reality. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, His Highness the Aga Khan.
Right Honourable Prime Minister, Honourable Premier of British Columbia, Honourable Ministers, distinguished guests. 3 years ago and 1 month, I had the honour of inviting the former Lieutenant Governor to lay the foundation stone of the building which we now see complete before us. Today it gives me the very greatest pleasure to welcome here the Prime Minister, Mr. Mulroney, and to thank him for agreeing to perform the opening ceremony. We are also privileged to have so many members of the federal and provincial governments present for an occasion which is a truly historic one for the Ismaili community in North America. The Ismaili community has sought to create a building here which is both Islamic in its architectural inspiration and of a quality to enhance the overall distinction of Burnaby. The Jamaat Khana is designed to be a social and cultural center, as well as a place of congregation. It expresses the Ismailis' desire to give of their best to the cultural and economic fabric of Canada. They are proud that it symbolizes their commitment both to this country's future and to their ancient heritage. Nor is there any dichotomy in this dual aim. In the future, I hope that the Ismaili community in Canada, having established the permanency of its home here, will become part of the reservoir of human talent on which this country can draw both nationally and internationally. Its members will be men and women who believe in enterprise and freedom, who are inspired by this country's respect for the individual, who will work to build the strength of Canada's economy and democratic institutions. Their spirit will be Canadian. Yet from their origin they will derive an understanding of other countries, which can be harnessed to the benefit of that special perspective on international relations which has earned Canada such worldwide respect. They will be well qualified to respond to the commitment to the Third World development which you, sir, made at the recent summit conference of Western leaders in Bonn. Mr. Prime Minister, it is my privilege to ask you to declare open this building, which symbolizes the Ismaili community's confidence in its future as an integral part of the nation you lead. Thank you.
Your Royal Highnesses, Mr. Premier, members of the Cabinet, members of the House of Commons, ambassadors, distinguished guests, and friends. Your Royal Highness, as you spoke a moment ago, I couldn't help but, looking at the crowd, make a small note to myself on the back of the program, because I thought I got, as you spoke, here today a small glimpse of Canada and what this country is all about. Because surely, Your Royal Highness, only here could you have a French-speaking Prime Minister of Irish origin from Quebec opening an Ismaili Center in British Columbia designed by an architect of Italian Catholic origin. And I think, Your Royal Highness, that says it better than perhaps statistics or anything else. What Canada is all about, a sense of tolerance and dignity. And I know that I speak on behalf of everyone here and all Canadians in extending to you, Your Royal Highness, and to your party, the warmest welcome here today, and to tell you and your people how proud we are that you have chosen Canada. I thank you in a special way for inviting me to share this important day with you. I know how much satisfaction you must all be taking in the accomplishment of such an important cultural and religious task. This building, I toured it a little earlier, makes our senses dance to the music of visual art, great tribute to the architect, and an art which tests not just our appreciation of form and light, but of the intellectual and spiritual messages revealed in the marble, sandstone, and glass brought to this beautiful city from so far away. So I've come to pay tribute on behalf of the people of Canada to the religion which inspired this building, to its people, and to His Royal Highness, the Aga Khan, and to the many other members of the Ismaili community whose generosity has given life to this beautiful religious center. Our philosophy, our values are reflected in this architecture. A building such as this is a compliment to Vancouver, to our nation, and to our civilization. And today, and I know I speak on behalf of representatives of all political parties whom I see here today, from all walks of life, when I tell the leadership of the community, and you, sir, that today we gather together to celebrate the opening of a building marked by subtlety and grace, and we do so with pride and affection.
Thank you, President, for those remarks on how important ambassadorial buildings are. I now have the pleasure of introducing a conversation with the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, the former Prime Minister of Canada. He ran the country for nearly a decade, a time full of change, and one of those moments so important to the Ismaili community was on August 23rd, 1985. As many of you may recall, Prime Minister Mulroney was at the inauguration ceremony of the Ismaili Centre, Vancouver, that day in 1985, right alongside His Highness the Aga Khan. And now, 35 years later, the former Prime Minister is here, not exactly alongside me, not so possible in these COVID times, but Prime Minister, I want to say thank you so much for joining me. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous, de partager votre temps, puis vos souvenirs de ce jour-là.
C'est un plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. Et 35 years is a long time, but the good news is that both the Aga Khan and I are still around. So it was a great day. We celebrated again very soon in August.
Now, the Ismaili community, obviously one of those communities that came to Canada and sought refuge here. What would you say the Ismaili community and the Ismaili Centre Vancouver have brought to that vision of Canada that we've been discussing today?
I remember it pretty well the same way. It was a glorious day out there in Burnaby. There was a huge crowd. All the Ismaili community was there pretty well, and lots of invited guests. And it was a celebration of the success of the Ismaili community in Canada. From the beginnings, which was around 1972, really when the expulsion took place and the welcoming took place in Canada. So there was a lot to celebrate, and it was a joyous day. And the Aga Khan was really opening a very splendid Ismaili Centre, and I was honored to be there on behalf of the Government of Canada to signal our support, not only for the centre, but for the tremendous contributions that the Ismaili community was making to Canada and continues to make.
What do you remember specifically about that day? What was it like sort of to be there? Because, you know, this was the first centre of its kind, really kind of a landmark moment. What was it like for you to be a part of that?
Well, I thought it was an important day for a number of reasons, one of which is that, as you know, I've been very strong on immigration in Canada. In fact, I raised the immigration levels from about 80,000 to 250,000, the highest in history, while I was in office, because I always believed that the immigrants were an essential element of the growth of Canada. They bring loyalty, they bring family values, they bring courage, and they bring tenacity, and they're very enterprising. They contribute strongly to the well-being of all Canadians, and so I was thrilled to be there because the Ismaili community was, and turns out to be, one of the greatest elements of immigration that Canada has known since its foundation. So for me it was a glorious day, and it was the weather and the celebration all contributed to making it memorable for me.
It was nice weather. Anything else that you can remember sort of behind the scenes to take us to that moment, take us back to that day? I know it was a while ago, 35 years.
Yeah, well, the Aga Khan and I go back a long way, almost 50 years, certainly 45. And in fact, our daughters, Zara and my daughter Caroline, were together at Harvard, and I used to see her there as well on frequent occasions. So we've had quite an association with the Aga Khan and his family over a long period of time. And I knew what this meant to him as the leader of the Ismaili community. Canada, I thought, was delighted to have them. And so we had it was like a family celebration there. And it was a joyous, very joyous day, which I remember with great affection.
Now you said off the top that, this was a while ago, 35 years ago. The world really has changed so much in the intervening years. Of course, back then, the mid-'80s, the Cold War hadn't even ended yet. Subsequently, there was the explosion of the internet, social media, globalization as well. And we have seen, a subsequent shift towards a more inward view, a rejection of pluralism in certain countries as well, with some populist movements gaining ground. Many see Canada as relatively immune to that populist wave. Do you think that's fair or a fair assumption, or do you think that's presumptuous?
No, I think you're essentially fair. There have been these movements around the world, some in Europe and some elsewhere, which are extreme nationalist movements. And one of the hallmarks of these movements is their attitude towards immigration, which is forbidding, which is severe, which is quite, in my judgment, vulgar. And so Canada has been and remains essentially immune to this kind of grotesque political behavior. But we have to be vigilant, because you never can tell when it's going to break through in another spot. And I think that, as I've said before, I think that the immigration policy of the Government of Canada must always be an open, welcoming one to people who want to share in the glory of what I consider to be Canadian citizenship. And I can't point to a group in modern Canadian history that has immigrated to this country and has not made a major contribution to our well-being. So we benefit from it, as do the people who come here seeking freedom or prosperity, or just a great place to raise their family.
I want to get back to immigration in a moment, because that's a really interesting point, but I would like to talk about that fact that you said we do have to be vigilant. What sort of advice do you have, to Canadian leaders, wrestling with this trend going forward, particularly when we see, the United States south of the border so polarized politically? What sort of advice do you have for how to be vigilant against those populist movements?
Well, if you seek the leadership of a political party in Canada, and you become either Prime Minister or Leader of the Opposition, it is your duty and your moral responsibility to speak out and to speak up on these major preoccupations of the country. And if immigration is one of them, you should know the values that we respect. I passed the Multiculturalism Act in 1988 to give life to the section of the Charter which dealt with this matter, and to protect minorities, religious, ethnic, and so on. And if anyone forgets that, he or she is forgetting his role as a moral leader of the country as Prime Minister. Look, if the Prime Minister remains silent and mute when there's a great national challenge that occurs, then bad things are going to happen, as they did, for example, in the Second World War, when our immigration policy was very, very anti-Semitic, as you'll remember. When the St. Louis came to trying to get into Canada with 1,000 souls aboard, the Government of Canada turned it away, and many of those people were returned to Europe, where they were lost in concentration camps. And so we have to be fair to everybody, and that's what makes the glory of this nation. And anyone who doesn't subscribe to that general view, you can have differences on modalities, but to that general view, should not be holding high office in this country.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the Multiculturalism Act, because I was going to ask you about it. Obviously, that was a world's first as well. It was a big deal when it happened. An integral part of Canada's identity for decades now. But you say, of course, political leaders today need to maintain those ideals and take that act to heart. What were the initial goals with that bill? What was so important to you to put that forward?
Well, precisely to protect the reality of our immigrants, who brought new ideas, new religions, new attitudes, and so on. And it was to protect them as minorities and to assist in integrating them into the broader Canadian community and to share in our national values. And that was the inspiration for that act, and I was honored to bring it into the House of Commons and to cause it to be passed, because I felt that over time and in the fullness of time, things could happen that could endanger the well-being of our immigrants and our minorities if that were not protected by the Multiculturalism Act. And it is now, and it's worked very well, I must say, ever since.
Now, it was an act as well, you know, to have a Canada that celebrates diversity, right? Every Canadian to be treated equally. How do you square those goals initially in the creation of the Multiculturalism Act with what we've been seeing in recent weeks, in recent months, in terms of protests against systemic racism and protests for change on that front, and for officials to be more aware of the current situation right now?
Well, I recently was invited to do a piece for the Globe and Mail in which I set out what was referred to as an agenda for Canadian, new Canadian greatness after COVID-19. How do you address some of these major problems? And I pointed out that the challenge for us is also to begin dealing with the problems and systemic racism that's been associated with our Aboriginal communities, our Indigenous communities, for forever, really, and we have to deal with that. But systemic racism for our Black communities, our communities of color, and our religious communities that are minorities, they have to be protected, like Fort Knox. You can't just have people pass legislation and say, well, look, I did my duty by passing the legislation. It is the Prime Minister's responsibility, and his cabinet and his government, whomever that turns out to be, and whatever political stripe, to say this is the law of Canada and we are going to enforce it. And we're going to enforce it by doing A, B, C, and D. And that's the way you move towards national greatness. Canada's a great country. It's always been generous and welcoming. But you know, we've made our mistakes, and there have been errors made as well. And so that's how you have to deal with this. The Prime Minister, he sets the moral tone for Canada. And if the Prime Minister stands up and says, this is right and this is wrong and Canada is going to be on the right side of history, that's what he should do. And only he can set the moral tone for the entire nation and provide the leadership, the bold leadership that Canada needs.
So that's important. That's an important point. It has to come from the tone of the Prime Minister, from the tone of the leaders of the country. But what about ordinary Canadians as well? What would you say they can do, especially in the time where there's a lot of civil unrest? We're thinking about these things and systemic racism a lot more. What do you see as the path for ordinary, regular Canadians on ways to promote multiculturalism or be open the way, the vision of Canada is set out?
Well, it has to be part of our everyday life for mothers and fathers, for school teachers, for provincial leaders, provincial cabinet ministers, premiers, prime ministers of Canada. We're all in this together. And this has to be accepted and promulgated by Ottawa across the country. It should be taught in our schools. There should be respect for our minorities, respect for our immigrants, particularly the most recent immigrants who have difficulty with languages sometimes and some of our customs. So it's a national commitment because it's going to define the way Canada is seen 50 and 100 years from now. We know it works. We know it's right because we've been around for 153 years. And while we have our problems, we're still viewed with admiration as one of the greatest and freest nations in the world. And that has to be maintained, and one of the underpinnings of that great success has been immigration. Now, you just witnessed what happened back in 1968 or 69 when the government of Canada, Pierre Trudeau at the time, admitted, along with the Aga Khan, they worked together, and I think there was 9,000 or 10,000 Ismailis who arrived in Canada, and their contribution has been magnificent. This is a Canadian success story. But it's not the only one. The Italians who came to Toronto, for example, and the Ukrainians who came to Western Canada, and so on. Even the Irish, years ago, when they first came in, we came here in 1832, the Mulroneys, but immigrants like everybody else. And so I think that it's part of our heritage, and it's an essential part of what made Canada such an admired nation here and around the world.
It's interesting you say that it has to be a national movement, you know, to accept immigrants and all those waves of immigrants that are still coming today. But what do you make of the fact when you hear some leaders, the head of the RCMP, for example, at first, to some provincial leaders, you know, sort of struggle with the definition of systemic racism? Do you see that as a problem?
Well, if you want to, if anyone says that he doesn't know if there's systemic racism in Canada, all he's got to do is go and read the Indian Act that's guided our Aboriginal peoples now for 150 years almost. There's systemic racism, and anybody who denies that doesn't understand what's really going on in Canada. That said, there have been tremendous advances in Canada. This is one of the most socially advanced nations in the world, in every way, from health care to scholarship in our universities, to education in our grade schools. It's a fabulous country. And all told, we've done pretty well. But we've got to keep our eye on the ball. And one of the challenges, the attitudes of people to, when they talk about old stock Canadians and new stock Canadians, that's nonsense. There's none of that. There's only Canadians. Now, we all have our religions and we all have our backgrounds, and we can tend to that with respect, but only if we respect our neighbor, who may be, I don't know, an Ismaili, who arrived 2 years ago. He's entitled to the same privileges of citizenship as I am. And so that's the attitude that we have to adopt. And by and large, as I say, you know, we've come through a lot as Canadians, and we've come through it pretty well. Because Canadians are remarkable people. They're very kind and they're generous. But you have to explain to them, if you're going to be the leader, why we're doing this and why we have to make changes from time to time. So it's an ongoing challenge for leadership. Bill Clinton used to say, you know, that leadership is the capacity to look around the corner of history just a little bit. And if you look around the corner of history, what do you see coming? Well, we've got a tremendous country here, but we don't have very many people. We need immigrants to it. We need to fill this place up. I've suggested to 75 million. We're slightly under 40 million now. We'll start to have greater clout and greater resonance around the world if we had 75 million people. And so we've got to, that's another policy that the government has to adopt, to accelerate and enhance the capacity of immigrant communities to come to Canada and to flourish in Canada. And I think it can be done.
Now, it's interesting. I want to grill down on that a little bit, because you did talk about looking around the corner of history. Of course, we're in these unprecedented times with COVID-19 pretty much affecting every facet of the lives of Canadians, you know, from, you know, their work lives, education, their home lives. It's everywhere. You mentioned immigration as a path forward, but when you look at the COVID crisis sort of affecting the world, the entire world, and Canada right now, some people say that's a way to sort of, a way that we can reimagine how things are in the country. You mentioned immigration as a path forward. What else do you see in your vision for the post-COVID world in Canada?
Well, we've got things to do economically to sustain this policy, and to give Canadians employment opportunities. We got to, for example, break down interprovincial trade barriers that are costing us anywhere from $18 to $50 billion a year. You can trade, a company in Ontario can trade more easily with Michigan than they can with Quebec. This is lunacy, and this has got to come to an end. Another way is if Canada took the leadership to try and establish a free trade area of the Americas, which would be 35 countries with 1 billion people in Latin America, with generating about $30 trillion a year in GDP, with Canada right at the heart of that new trade arrangement. If you want to know how prosperous that would be, just look at NAFTA, which we did with President Bush a long time ago now. But NAFTA today is a grouping of 3 countries, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, which represents about 7% of the world's population, and yet it generates 29% of the world's wealth. That establishes conclusively to me that free trade is a great instrument of prosperity. And you need that prosperity to provide economic opportunity and freedom for our immigrant communities who are coming to populate our country, which is badly in need of waves of immigration. So it all fits together. And there are many things that the government can do. I laid out about 10 of them in that post-COVID-19 Canada that I was invited to write about. And I think there's lots we can do to maintain our growth and our prosperity, but most importantly, our freedom and our protections of minorities.
We touched, a little bit on how this pandemic could be an opportunity to perhaps reimagine Canada and move forward in the post-COVID world. What do you see as sort of the role of institutions like the Smiley Centre? What sort of role could they play in that reimagination, in changing Canada for the better, perhaps in the post-COVID world?
Well, I think the Smiley Centre is an indication of its own importance, because it provides leadership and counsel and guidance to an entire community. And because of the respect and the admiration in which that community is held, for example, we're talking now about Vancouver, that this has a ripple effect throughout society. And I know that the Ismaili community is and its leadership out there is determined to provide wise judgment and good leadership to its followers, but also to the rest of the community in helping us in a general way get out of this mess that we're in with COVID-19. Now, no one can solve it alone. No community can do that. But every one of us can contribute and do our own little bit. And that's the only way Canada is going to come out of this, with all of us cooperating together. Whether it was the First World War, or the Second World War, or Korea, or the Cold War, whatever. Canada was an active participant, and we played our own role, which was important, but not overpowering. But without countries like Canada, there would have been no solutions. And I take the same attitude with regard to the communities in Canada. There's no one overpowering community. We're all in this together, and all of our communities, like, for example, the Ismaili Centre in Vancouver, this is an instrument of leadership, and people look up to them and look up to it. And the principles of your religion that are enhanced and articulated by your leadership, these inspire other people. And they're consistent with the manner in which a great country like Canada continues to grow.
And everybody needs that inspiration, right?
Absolutely.
You talked about, you've mentioned it a couple times in our conversation about that agenda for Canadian greatness that you outlined in the Globe and Mail. You talked a lot about immigration. I want to touch a little bit more on what else you see as part of that vision for Canadian greatness, to, the need to maintain our destiny as an exceptional nation whose citizenship is valued by countless millions around the world. What does that mean? What is that vision for you?
Well, in the Old Testament, there's a statement to the effect from the prophet that young men have visions and old men dream dreams. And Canada needs the vision that only youth can provide, to satisfy the dreams of those of us who have gone before. One of the parts of this, of course, has to be a strong assertion of sovereignty in the North. There's our breadbasket for the future. 150 years from now, that's going to be where we were 153 years ago when the country was started. We have enormous possibilities up there, but we have to look after it. We've got to look after our Aboriginal peoples. We've got to provide infrastructure. We've got to provide a military presence up there. We've got to establish a telecommunications base, a cyber warfare base or cyber capacity up there, and to deal with cyber warfare, I should say. And so we need a strong assertion of sovereignty across Canada's north up to the Arctic Circle, which we own, as I told President Reagan, which Canada owns, the Northwest Passage, lock, stock, and icebergs. And that's how I got the agreement with them, the Canada-U.S. agreement on Arctic sovereignty. So there are all kinds of things we can do. That's one of them. And governments will come up with their own ideas and probably better ideas, because this all depends on the enthusiasm and the vision of our youth, as I say, to be able to deal with the dreams of fellows and people like me who are older members of society now.
Lock, stock, and iceberg. So sometimes you just need some tough words for some of your opponents, huh?
Well, of course, yeah. If you're dealing with the Americans, believe me, you've got to know what you're talking about, and you've got to have your own tough assertion of our sovereignty. You know, this is not a rundown little nation you're talking about here. This is a great country, one of the greatest in the world, and we have to defend our prosperity as we defend our integrity and as we defend our sovereignty. And that's the responsibility of the Prime Minister and his governments, but also of all of us in our own way. We just talked about one with the Ismaili Center in Vancouver. This is all part and parcel of the big puzzle of the mosaic called Canada.
And everyone has their part to play.
Absolutely. That's why everyone is so valuable to us, and that's why we welcome the ideas and the attitudes and the views of people from afar who come to find succor and sanctuary and prosperity in Canada for their families. And so to be true to those ideals, we have to live with the ideals and defend them, the ones we've been talking about, you and I today.
Now, the Ismaili community, obviously one of those communities that came to Canada and sought refuge here. What would you say the Ismaili community and the Ismaili Center Vancouver have brought to that vision of Canada that we've been discussing today?
Well, first of all, they've brought, I think the Ismaili community now has to have, 70 or 80,000 people in the country. I'm guessing, but it should be somewhere in that neighborhood. And they've been a fantastic addition to Canada. They have brought their sense of industry, their brilliance, their love of family, their loyalty to Canada, their loyalty to their faith, and they've contributed enormously because of their entrepreneurship to Canada's prosperity. And so if you were looking for a near perfect example of the kinds of immigrants that Canada needs, we've just defined them, and that's the Ismaili community. It was a great idea that the Aga Khan had, my old friend had, all those years ago when he approached the Prime Minister of Canada, and had all those immigrants come here because Canada was the big winner in that. I'll leave Uganda to somebody else, but I'll tell you that Canada was the big winner of that deal.
Well, on that note, I think that's a good way to end this conversation. Prime Minister Mulroney, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, for sharing with us your thoughts of that day of the Ismaili Center Vancouver when it was inaugurated. A moment that so many people in the Ismaili community remember fondly, and they remember you as being such an integral part of that. But but also for giving us a peek into your thoughts, your dreams, as you said, in terms of where Canada is going and what part we all have to play in it. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
I'm delighted to be with you, and it was a wonderful experience for me at the time and now. Alors, merci à vous également. C'était une occasion formidable en 1985, et ça l'est toujours aujourd'hui. So thank you and congratulations to you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Visionary Voices. It's been the first of several installments in what is a series that is looking at the Ismaili Centre, Vancouver, and its anniversary. 35 years is a long time. That means lots of memories. And so the idea is to keep celebrating those 35 years and celebrating the symbolic building that means so much to so many in the community, particularly for those lucky ones who are from Vancouver, like me, who get to enjoy the building quite often. Now, next month, stay tuned for a journey through time. It'll be a look at the history of the center, as well as later on in September, there will be a conversation with the architect who designed the building, Bruno Freschi. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, take care, stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.